Thank you so much. We have an absolutely stellar group of authors here, and between them, they have written 24 novels. So I think if we are going to find out where fiction comes from, we have the right group over here. I want to leave the talking as much as I can to the authors, but I'm going to start with a small little quote from Geetanjali's book, and then hopefully you can all speak on that. So this is from Geetanjali's book that she wrote in 1998, but was translated only in 2024, and it's called Hamara Sheher Urs Baras. When there isn't curfew, the three of them, those are the three characters, Sharad, Shriti, and Hanif, come out into the open to chase history, to see it face to face in those neighborhoods and lanes where the stagnant drain water has now begun to flow with blood. And people have left their braziers cold and have wandered off with coals to start fires elsewhere in the void. And the sense of burning chafes our nostrils and fills our insides. So I want to pick on that phrase, they come out into the open to chase history. So does fiction come from there? Does fiction come from the desire to chase history? Maybe Geetanjali, you want to start and we can take it from there?
Well, I think in general, yes. But I would say that it's not going to be the same thing every single time. So you're chasing history sometimes. You're chasing something else sometimes. You are chasing your insides which you have no idea what they contain. So it's a very scary act. I mean, Kafka let out demons which he didn't want anybody to really talk about while he was there. In fact, not even after him. So I think it's different things one chases at different moments. So, and just as, because we are different people at different times.
Sugi, do you want to take that forward? Because I think your novel, Brotherless Nights, is a bit of that as well. It's a bit about chasing history.
Yes, what a beautiful quote. I do think, for me, it's about chasing history, and for me, that makes me think of, I don't know, chasing the tail, really, chasing the bit that's escaping, so trying to get at the edge of it, or the part that has been hidden or obscured in some way, and looking to excavate that, bring it out into the open, as the quote suggests, but not the center of the thing, the edge of the thing.
Jenny, you've been called a weaver bird of German fiction, and I thought that was an interesting phrase, a weaver bird. So you take parts from everywhere and you build a nest, and I think that's a nice construction. But do you feel do you think you are sort of taking bits from history and building a whole?
Yeah, I think for me, writing is more like something like exploring something that I don't understand. So there's always a question in the beginning, and my impression is, the older I get, I know better that there are so many connections to look at if you want to understand one thing. So there are different stories that end up to build perhaps this, I wouldn't call it a nest. I wouldn't call it a nest, not at all. I would perhaps call it a knot or something like that. So, yeah, and I just like to take my time to look at all the aspects of one thing, and sometimes from different perspectives of view, so that the story is made of not just one plot, but by many stories.
I think, yeah, that question of chasing history is so helpful, as long as it includes the notion that what you might want to do is interrogate history, at the same time contradict the official history of a place or a people. History should never be treated as if it was some innocent, unconstructed truth. I think what we find as writers very often is that what we take for history is in fact a very ideologically assembled message about a people. The British, for example, have been world experts for quite a long time at constructing narratives that it deems to be universal. that British history is history. Well, in fact, we're in a place that knows very well how constructed Britain's notion of history is. I grew up in Scotland with many received notions about history, about what Scotland was, about what the Scottish people were, about how the class system worked and what my place was in it. I have to say that as soon as I began to feel that I was becoming a novelist, very young, I realized that what I was doing was being a vandal, not only interrogating official truth, but in a sense trying to enter a rebel voice, my own voice, the voice of my family, of people who hadn't really been in literature. They were working people, they didn't have books written about them by and large, or by them. So that notion of history, I think, is a provocation. We should always feel provoked by the official truth, I think.
That's so well said. We should feel provoked by the official truth. David, do you want to add something?
I guess I feel strongly that I've never really written a historical novel in that grand 19th century sense. They've always been personal histories, but I am acutely aware of time, and I suppose they're personal histories in the sense that they usually explore love and emotions and relationships at different stages of our lives. So my last book was about what it feels like to be 16, and the book before that was what it feels like to be, what love feels like in our late 50s. I realized of the 6 books, only 3 are set in the present day, so I do try and capture particular moments, but I guess I'm much more concerned about the specific emotions and dilemmas that we have at various stages of our lives. And the nearest I've come to writing a novel which has a kind of sweep, which is One Day, which goes from 1988 to 2007, always the focus is on how time changes us, the pull of nostalgia, sometimes the dangers of nostalgia, the dangers of holding on to events in the past. So I'm always keen, if I'm writing about the past, to be accurate, but always the focus is on the personal. In fact, if you rearrange the novels, you get sort of love at 16 to love at 56 and everything in between. There's a kind of a history of that emotion at different stages of our life.
I think the wonderful thing about this panel is that the novels are all so different, but if I was to sort of find a common thread, I would say each of them is an act of empathy, and I think that's what literature does. It's empathetic, and you kind of go into the shoes of another character. I think we were talking about time, and Sugi, you've mentioned this before, about how your stories, or the ones that you write, are not of moments, but of years. And I think that's so true of all the authors over here, that all your books chronicle a large span of time, whether it's personal, whether it's historical. And I think, in a way, that's what fiction does. It is interrogating history, and it's also doing something which journalism cannot, and which possibly only the novel can do. So can we just talk about chronicling time and how the novel does that well, and how fiction does that well?
Sure. I think especially coming to fiction after journalism, I was grateful for the unclear scope with which I was able to begin, the messiness. In both cases, often beginning with a question, but in the case of fiction, not having to turn it in at a particular moment, and therefore having the space to double back and rethink things and wander a little bit. And to discover that the period of time, I originally began writing Brotherless Night, and I thought I would write about a different period of time. And then I had the space to discover that I was very interested in the 1980s, which was news to me, news that I couldn't have discovered in the space of nonfiction. And the capaciousness of the novel, the way that it can expand and contract to contain intimate moments, and also the way that you can crunch a year into a sentence. I haven't yet done the journalism that succeeds at that. I think there are people doing it, but yeah, I think I was surprised at the years I ended up being interested in.
Jenny, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think literature can do something that journalists can't do. So it's a different way of looking at the world, at the connections to the myth of someone, of a country, to the for me also, there's also this aspect of the living and the dead people. So, you know, you have a dialogue between people who aren't there anymore. Literature in general has a lot to do with memory and keeping memory and making sense of things that don't seem to that you could understand it. So I think you can take more time to explore things. One of my books is about African refugees in Berlin, and a journalist would just pass by quickly and ask them some questions and then write an article. But I really took time to spend time with the refugees, to follow their path through the German bureaucracy and things like that. So and also, if you are dealing with history, so some of her books are taking place in the 20th century, so throughout the whole century. So you would go to archives, you would do some research, you would speak to people, and it's like a deeper process that you live through while writing a book. And I liked it a lot because it's always like also learning something yourself and being like interested and finding things that you were never looking for, and I like that.
Andrew, I think in your most recent novel, Caledonian Road, you mentioned how you did a lot of reportage. You actually met Bangladeshi garment workers who were in London. Many of them perished during COVID, and how I think your novel has been called Dickensian because you weren't just sitting at your desk and imagining, you were actually going out and meeting people. So can we talk also about how fiction comes not just from imagination, but actually going, meeting people and doing what journalists do on a day-to-day basis as well?
I mean, one of the wonderful things about literature, world literature, is that there is no single definition of what a novel is. There are as many novels potentially as there are imaginations to create them. You know, there is no single truth. The world is big enough for, you know, the novels of Virginia Woolf and for the great social novels that someone else might have written. For my own part, I can say that the border between journalism and fiction has always interested me since the beginning. This notion of truth, of findability, of research, of actuality, and what happens to it in the mind of a novelist has been intriguing to me since I was a child, I think. And if you take a figure, a contemporary figure, almost at random, such as, say, Donald Trump, imagine what Tolstoy would do with him. Imagine what Balzac or Jane Austen would do with Donald Trump. Because let me tell you, without hesitation, they would enter into the strange, apocalyptic business of his motivation. That is what they would do. A frustrated intelligence would peel back the events, the policy, the public appearance, the lies, the ego, and get to the soft heart of the matter. And the soft heart, if you can conjure with such a horrible notion in relation to this character, is full of truths, secrets, lies, beliefs, fears, that only a novelist, I think, can truly animate. At least no journalist yet, and he's one of the most covered people on the planet. As we speak, people are pressing the keys on multiple keyboards, trying to define this man, but give me Tolstoy for 2 minutes, and he would go into the secret history of that man in a way that would make you weep.
I think, David, your novels kind of go into the interior of the mind very well. I mean, maybe this is just a segue which I thought of right now. Would you ever like to write about Trump?
Oh, you know, I feel very fortunate because I'm aware of this history of journalism and research, and I've never really felt. It's not that I've not felt the need. I guess I'm probably imagining and creating characters that are very definitely not based on anyone I've met or anyone in real life. They're kind of, I suppose, much more akin to the kind of process that an actor might take to building a character. I do hardly any research. I suppose the only exception to that is from almost the first novel, I've always stood wherever the characters have stood. I've always gone absolutely everywhere. I could take a map and show you where every single scene takes place, with the exception of one day, in which Dexter Goes to India. And shamefully, I'd never really been to India. I had to just harvest the experiences of friends who had. So I'm very diligent about that. I take a lot of photographs. With this latest novel, You Are Here, I made sure that I made the same journey as the characters. And that in itself was incredibly inspiring. It suggested all kinds of scenes, all kinds of moments, all kinds of reactions to the landscape. So that's the nearest I get to a kind of journalism, I think. Apart from that, it really is all made up. I suppose the unacknowledged influence is the experiences of my friends, which I'm very careful not to plagiarize, but which have inevitably fed into these novels, which are very much about friendship and about social relations and romantic relationships and the difficulty of that.
Geetanjali, do you want to add something?
I don't know if I'm adding anything, but let me try. I think fiction is coming from both fiction and non-fiction, and you cannot, really separate the two like things entirely different. So, for me, sorry, I lost the thread of whatever I was going to say, but one of the things that I feel, listening to these, the things that all of you have said, one of the things I feel perhaps a little more than some of the other writers is the oppression of history and society in current times. And as a writer, while I know there's no getting away from that, there is in me a great desire to somehow save something else that fiction is, which is play. And I think I try very much to get into my writing with play. And that gives me a lot of language, a lot of strategy, a lot of flexibility, and whether I like it or not, history and society creeps into it. But I do want, again and again, to somehow retrieve play. It's not about, for me, I would not like it to be just better than journalism to tell people about society. I would like it to be something else as well, which is literature, which is play, which is storytelling, and we are constantly expanding the notion of storytelling and what constitutes a story. I would like all that very much on the table when I'm working.
That's so interesting. Does anyone want to add to the idea of play and fiction? Or how novel is a play?
I guess I try and hold on to a sense of play, and particularly with dialogue. I mean, I like the idea of putting two characters in a room and letting them play. That's often what dialogue is. What good dialogue is a kind of tennis. There's a kind of back and forth and flurries of humor and antagonism. And for me, there's definitely an element of improvisation, and I try and keep that joyful, because when it becomes a bit of a chore, that shows on the page. So I definitely have to remind myself that to be a writer, a published writer, is a great privilege, and that if you should be enjoying it, even in the grind of the third or fourth draft.
I think what I really like about playing while writing is I studied theater and I was directing first, and in theater you have this freedom of just inventing a setting, so not just telling a plot or something like that. And in a way I really feel close to this way of inventing structures that are challenging to me myself. So one of my books has a female main character, and I wanted to explore the subject of losing someone, of death, and of how the material of a biography is being told in different phases of the life. So I made her die 5 times. So she's dying 5 times, and then I would let her resurrect. So I would take back the death, and meet her 20 years later again, and then she would have another life, and she would put a different value to the early times in her life. So I really was, it was a kind of playing in this sense of freedom, and I think this is very important to literature.
The notion of performance should never be forgotten. In a writer's creativity, I think play and performance is so central. Charles Dickens's wife once arrived at the door of his study, and she could hear noises in the room. And finally, she broke into the room, and there was Dickens in front of the mirror, shouting in various voices and pulling his face into various contorted, caricatures. And she said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm writing." And the same was true of the great British writer Bruce Chatwin, who was at the Santa Maddalena Foundation, which is a writer's retreat in Italy. And the cleaner was working on the stairs, and she heard bizarre noises coming from the study. And she ran down and said to the organizer of the place, "I don't know what's happening in Mr. Chatwin's room. I think he has geese and possibly a cow inside his room." And she said, "Oh, don't worry about it. He's just writing a poem." Play and performance are central. These things don't exist until you imagine them, and then you have to, in a sense, embody them. David's right. I mean, I think it's helpful if you have an actor's instinct to be a novelist. Not all novelists would agree, but it seems to me quite a helpful,
Ziggy, would you agree? Or?
Certainly, I was thinking about the ways in which, going back to your first question, I think the thing that I enjoy playing with is the history, because so much of the time when you're writing about history, you're writing both for people who know the history. Well, you're writing for people who know the history, people who think they know the history, and people who don't know any of it. And so to talk to all of those people at the same time is to build 2 or 3 different kinds of code and have them operating at the same time, which is really fun, because you can cram all sorts of things in there that are inside, winks to the people who know, and and they know, and someone else who's along for the ride thinks that character is just there, and that it's a reference to something that couldn't be captured anywhere else. I think that there are kinds of community knowledge and verification that can exist in fiction that that's a kind of play for me, to put in I think this might be a video game term, to put in as many Easter eggs as possible, to sort of, to have as many inside jokes with myself. Because, at the end of the day, I spent so long with that book, longer than anyone will spend reading it. So, it has to be, absolutely what Geetanjali said, it has to be play, because otherwise you won't finish.
That's so interesting. I think all the 5 most recent novels that you all have written, I think the one sort of common element is that they are about transitions. And I think especially David and Andrew's book, you have these male characters or characters who are sort of going from the certitude of youth to, muddling middle age, where you're just less certain about life. And I think, Andrew, you have this very interesting male character who's, very flamboyant, very successful. And one day he's writing a self-help book because he thinks he needs to make some money. And I love the title of that book. It's called Why Men Weep in Cars.
That was actually something from life. I was in this situation in New York, and it was one of those late night dinners, and the woman sitting next to me happened to be a senior editor at a self-help publishing house. And I think I'd probably had too much Chardonnay by that point. And I said to her, "I could write one of those books." And she said, no, every author thinks they could write a self-help book. They're really difficult. I said, no, I understand. I know they're difficult, but I could do one. She said, "Okay then, what's the title?" And I said instantly, "Why Men Weep in Their Cars." And she leaned in and said, "What's the subtitle?" I said, "The Crisis of Male Identity in the 21st Century." She said, "I'll get you a fortune." So it was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that I would then use that title in a novel. And I have to tell you that I can only speak for myself, as we all can, of course, but when I was going to my office is outside the house, and I walk across a park in London to get to my office, and sometimes I'd meet people with their dogs in the morning while I was in the middle of writing Caledonian Road, and they'd say, why are you in a hurry? You're almost, sprinting. And I said, I want to get to my office to see what happens to this guy who's the main guy in my book. Even as the author, sometimes you're not quite sure how this is going to go, how this character is going to survive your imagining of him. So it's not that you're not in control of it, but you are somehow woven into this great dramatic expectation, and you're not sure where in the whole operation you stand. It's a mysterious business. We're here trying to define it for you, but it is ultimately quite mysterious.
You want to add to that in the sense of transitions or the mystery of it, either one?
Oh, well, I always love this idea that the character will go in different directions, but I'm a very neurotic planner, so I come from a screenwriting tradition where they won't let you do the fun stuff, the jokes and the dialogue, until you've really worked out every single story beat and planned it out and written this deathly document of a synopsis in which everything happens. So when I wrote my first novel, I gave my editor a 20-page breakdown of the characters' backstories and what was going to happen in each chapter. And she'd never really seen a document like this and said, you really don't have to do this. And I've sort of shaken it off a little bit, but I do always know pretty much every single unit of action. And for me, then it becomes like a series of scenes that I can color in. And within those units, within those blocks, there's always a pleasure of invention and discovery, but I always know the beginning, middle, and an end. And I guess it partly comes from a neurotic anxiety of not being able to finish the book, writing myself into a blind alley and not really knowing where to go. But I also like embarking on the first draft of the novel, knowing that there'll always be something fun to do, and that I can assemble these units into something that will not necessarily work, but will function as with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I long to be taken over by a character and to be surprised, but I'm pretty not mechanical. That makes it sound dry. I love the experience, but for me, there's the architecture of the novel. It has to be in place before I can do the fun stuff, the invention that comes along the way.
You ever find, though, that a character is strangely teaching you something that you didn't know before?
Yeah, there's definitely a voice that becomes more and more distinctive and will say and do surprising things. There's always an arc that's in place, but I do find my feelings about them change, and you do become attached to them, and you do find yourself thinking with the latest novel, a Marnie voice and a Michael voice, and constantly jotting down things that they say to you. But that sounds a little more mystical, but I think, broadly speaking, again, it's a kind of actor's approach. You know where you're heading, and you face the obstacles along the way, and that provides the material and the friction and the dialogue.
You want to add to that about, do you know where your characters are going or not really?
I think if I knew, I couldn't go on, because I think I'm exactly the opposite. So it's fascinating to hear about your process, because I so enjoy, I have sometimes taught a class on how to revise, and I've used film adaptations to do that, because I think, screenwriters who are kind of sometimes really merciless about plot and to advance things. And I feel like I learned so much from it, but I think for me, at least with the first draft, there has to be this struggle, because I have no idea what's going to happen. And if I had an outline, whenever I've had an outline, I've always ended up throwing it out.
I certainly don't know where the characters are going. And I think I've been writing for so many years, I quite enjoy that now, not knowing. And it becomes an adventure for me as well. It becomes a voyage of discovery for me as well. And it becomes an act of risk and an act of faith. So risk, because I don't know, where I'm going to crash, but an act of faith that there's a whole intuition which has been honed over the years, which is full of, all those various things that we keep talking about: history, memories, imagination, observation, God knows what all. That is aesthetic sense. That is going to guide me and bring me somewhere. So for me, it just becomes, again, I'll use the word play, but I really don't know in most of my works what the work is going to be about, except the one which has recently come out, because I knew I wanted to write about communalism, Hindu-Muslim relations. But in all the others, I really don't know where I'm going to start, where it'll go, what the characters are going to do. And for me, it's always been a lovely discovery that something triggers me, something very inane, something very mundane, something very daily, sets me off. And at some point, it's almost as if it's not me, it is them who have taken over. And that is the point for me, which I feel is the point of hope and creativity. And I feel maybe now we'll get somewhere.
Also, for me, it's often so that I have like a question or an idea in the beginning, and I have a kind of idea of the material that I will use, or like where to put the story, and then it's something like a core of the story waiting for me, and I have, when I start writing a novel, I would look for the right entrance, so I would like starting to write 10 or 12 beginnings and just try them out if they let me in. So if the story lets me in, and once I have made my decision or I have a feeling that this might work, then I just start at the beginning and mostly I end in the end. But there's much of a freedom in between. I know roughly where it might lead me, or like the chapters or the stories that I would like to include, but within the chapters, I have no idea what happens to me. So it's always also an adventure. And then it also happened to me that I did some research, and the research would destroy my first approach to the story. So I had to reinvent the way in which the story is being told.
I think, Sugi, you spent 20 years on your second book, and we've all been talking about how, some authors know where their characters are going, and some authors don't know where their characters are going from the start. But how do the characters influence you, especially when you've spent so long with you?
I should say that in describing my approach, I'm not necessarily recommending it. I think, I got really obsessed with the characters, and the longer I wrote about them, the more they became mine, and the less they became actually connected to any real-life figures, and the more I felt free to invent because I had spent so much time with them. I mean, there were also characters who ended up being combined with each other or ended up getting cut. There's a whole strange novel set in New York that's not very good, that is in a drawer somewhere and has a totally different tone. I mean, listening to Jenny, I was just curious to think about how all of us interact with voice differently, because the voices of all of the books are really different. And I can talk about a lot of things in a very self-conscious, pretending I'm a literary critic and that I understand my own process retroactively kind of way. But a place where I can't do that actually is the voice. So when I think about how the characters influence me, the characters who have influenced me the most are my first-person protagonists, who sort of presented themselves and said that they were telling the story, and I didn't really have very much say about them at all, which was completely fine with me and something to which I yielded entirely. And I mean, as you were saying before, we're sort of, this is so subconscious and so instinctual. And I always feel like I should caveat that I'm trying to explain my subconscious, but then maybe we don't actually want me to. I don't know that, it's hard to, I think that if I understood my own process well enough, I wouldn't need to write the book.
What I find particularly fascinating, I think, about literature is how, in the beginning, you need a referential which is outside in the world, out there, whether inside you or out there. It's a reality outside the work which is going to come. But something quite fun and amazing begins to happen when you no longer need that outside, in a sense. You enter or start, a world starts, almost organically and genetically sort of proliferating from something small. And that world becomes its own reference in a way, which is just a way of saying things, because obviously, you are getting things which belong to the past, the present, the future, and all around and everything. But, it's almost an auto-referential world that starts getting created. And you learn, I think it's quite humbling also, because you learn something which I'll only describe as a suspension of disbelief, where completely wonderful, strange, new things can happen. And if someone's looking for them outside, of course, they cannot happen. I mean, like some of you who may have read my book, it's the crows that start, sort of having meetings on, parallel meetings up there on the tree, and talking about what the humans are doing to their world. And at some point start, getting fascinated by saris and their types. And, it's a completely ridiculous scene, but where does it come from? And it becomes such a, even to me, such a fascinating scene, which is very real, belongs to the work, has a reality which belongs to that thing. And that for me is wonderful, the wonderful possibility of literature.
Does anyone want to add anything? I'm sorry, I don't know how much time is left. Oh, okay. The timer's not working. Add something? Okay, great. We only have 5 minutes left, and I think there are a lot of questions. So maybe we can pass the mic around.
Hello, good afternoon. My question regarding fiction. When you're writing fiction, how do you dwell with the characters which are present in the real life also, and you are transforming them into something, a fusion of something fiction and non-fiction together. So to keep the fiction itself in it and the non-fiction also at the same place, how do you deal with that?
This has been, thank you for that question. It's a very good one, and we could spend a whole hour on that alone, but I'll try to be brief. I have to say that since the beginning of the novel, certainly the novel in English, this has been a central problem. When Daniel Defoe wrote the book that we all know as Robinson Crusoe, there was a real Alexander Selkirk who had been washed up in a desert island, and he influenced Defoe when he came to write that book. He borrowed from it, he was inspired by it, he enlarged upon it, he invented and grafted new worlds around and on top of the original story, and he made no apologies for that. That is what novelists have been doing since the beginning. I quote an English example. There in France, we have the famous Madame Bovary. If you look at the records, in that part of France, in Normandy, there was a Delphine Delamay whose case, married to a doctor, had an affair, ended in a suicide. Sorry for the spoiler. This was known to the great Flaubert. He grafted his imagination. And by the way, he was right to do that. That is what literature does. It draws very often on actuality, but it transforms it into something else.
Thank you. Sorry, there's an elderly gentleman here.
Hello, I'm very keen to know wherein lies the strength of a novel. Does it lie in the narration, the way a novelist narrates the story, or does it lie in the characterization? I mean, what would be your tips, for a student to know of a fiction? What should he look for when he reads a fiction? Number one. Number two,
One question only.
I would like your observations on Beckett's novels also.
Tips for fiction.
I'm not sure I can give you an answer. I think often a novel's I know from my own writing, sometimes I've not got the characterization quite right. You know, if I change a character's name halfway through the writing process, then I immediately feel insecure, like I haven't done the preparation, like I'm an under-rehearsed actor, to use that again. So within my own work, I don't want to generalize about the novel. I try and get everything in place before I start, so I feel that characterization strong, story is strong, particularly the narrative voice. You know, it took me a long time to find a third person narrative voice that worked for me, an attitude to the world and to the characters that felt natural and fluent. And I didn't really get that until my third novel, so apologies to anyone who read the first two. I tried to make sure that everything is rehearsed before I start the writing. And I can't tell you anything about Beckett's novels. I wish I could give you some insight. But it's hard to, I wouldn't like to generalize, but I try to make sure that there's no obvious unevenness before I start.
I think just one last question, please.
So there's lots of classes for writing. What can and what cannot be taught in the craft of writing a novel?
I think it's worth saying that there's a great mystery about whether you can actually teach a person from scratch to write a good novel. You know, it's a mysterious process, it's unknowable, and its unknowability is actually quite helpful to the person who's doing it. If we knew, it would just be like painting by numbers. It's a human process like love. How do we explain it? The deep mystery of it is part of its fascination. But you can teach people to edit. You can teach them to improve pace, to understand tone, to define their language and their terms, to think about structure, to think about color, history, elements of the self, subjectivity, autobiography. You can do great work with students, getting them to home in on what is there. Can you give them the spark of inspiration? No. But can you improve them into a state of self-knowledge and technical mastery through the coursework? I believe you can go some distance with that.
I suppose I would say very briefly that the great writing school is, of course, reading. And I think you can teach someone to read like a writer, to read and ask themselves, how is this achieved? What is third person doing that first person doesn't do? What is the present tense doing that the past tense can't do? And to read critically and observe and have an awareness of technique. How is this? Why am I feeling this? Why am I thinking this about this character? And I think that approach can be taught, but there's another whole element that perhaps is more mysterious.
I also want to add how, David, you mentioned that if an author ever has to do a reading, they've kind of done an edit again, right? So an author is never happy with their final novel as well.
No, I once went to a digital book company, and they said, you know, you do realize that you can rewrite your book, and we can just send it out onto everyone's digital readers, and you can change things and fix things, and it's very appealing. It's as appealing as being able to, you know, Photoshop your old school photographs. It's a very nice idea, I guess. But I suppose I have to accept that once it's taken off me, that's it, it's fixed. But when I do a reading, yes, I usually cut. I usually make things tighter and shorter. I think it's very rare when you go back to a novel that you add words. You should always really be taking it away. And I would also add, if there are any writers here, it's very good to edit on paper. Rewriting, physically rewriting, is a great way of making sure that every sentence works. And you should try and, the great help also is time. If you can put a manuscript aside for a little while, it turns you from the writer to the reader, and you become much more ruthless about editing, much more clear-headed. So those would be my 3 quick practical tips.
Okay. Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more? No, I'm so sorry. Okay, one more. The boss has said yes.
Yes. The question was if one can write a novel without or with very little dialogue in it, and I really tried it out. So with my first novel, I was afraid of writing dialogues. I thought I couldn't write dialogues at all. So it's a very hermetic story of it's called the Old Child. So it's just like about her, what she's doing, how she's behaving, and she's someone who's very closed as a person. So I wouldn't need much dialogue for her. And only then, after that, I was asked to write a play. So this was the opposite of a novel without the dialogue. And then I thought, okay, I try it out. And then I wrote a play with only dialogue in it, of course, and that this was also kind of interesting to me that I was able to do it, but in the first moment I was afraid.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Geetanjali. Thank you, Sugi, Andrew, David, and Jenny. This was a fascinating topic, and we could continue. Thank you.